Today is the first Sunday of Lent, and to mark the occasion, we're beginning a brand new message series that we're calling Attitude Adjustment. We're looking at a particular attitude adjustment that every single one of us needs to make. Everyone. In fact, the less you think you need to make this adjustment, the more you probably do. And as soon as you think you've mastered it and rest comfortably in the knowledge that you have it, you've lost it. This attitude is a virtue. A virtue is a habit of high moral standard. And this virtue is, in a certain sense, the most fundamental and important virtue. Over the next 5 weeks, we're going to look at its application when it comes to living out the Christian life more successfully. What we're talking about could be called the most fundamental virtue because it lies beneath every other virtue. What we're talking about is humility. Humility. And while humility is critically important, it is often misunderstood. Many people think of humility as weakness or low self-esteem or a lack of ambition, a conscious effort to minimize or downplay our accomplishments, or a low opinion of yourself, or maybe even a bad opinion of yourself. None of that is humility. None of that is humility. Neither is any of that a virtue or a mark of spiritual maturity. In fact, it's a mark of insecurity that we have to work our way out of. Humility is not a low opinion of yourself, it's a clear opinion of yourself. St. Bernard once said, "Humility is knowledge of yourself as you really are." Humility is knowledge of yourself as you really are. The word humility is derived from a Latin word, humilitas, which gives us our English word for ground or grounded. So to be humble is to be grounded or to be rooted. In his book, Good to Great, Jim Collins studied companies that successfully moved from good performers to great performers in the marketplace. In his study, he studied some of the greatest performers in the marketplace in recent years. And his study discovered what he came to call level 5 leaders. Every company he studied that moved from good to great did so under the leadership and direction of level 5 leaders. His premise is that level 5 leaders represent a rare combination of sincere humility and strength of will. He said that these leaders are absolutely ambitious, but they channel their ambition into the company or the project that they're leading and serving, not in themselves. Well, people who live the virtue of humility are like that. They're not weak. They don't lack ambition. Instead, they channel their strength, their ambition, and their creative energy, their intellect, and their resources into something beyond themselves. To begin to unpack this, we're going to take a look at the book of Deuteronomy. To set the scene, the Israelites had been in the desert for 40 years. God's intention had been to bring them directly to the Promised Land, which was a matter of only several days' journey from Egypt. But in their impatience, ingratitude, and arrogance, they sinned before God. And so, as a penance, they were forced to wander around, literally in circles, for decades. They wandered around until everybody in that sinful, prideful, arrogant generation had passed away. And at this point in the story, God is calling the next generation of Israelites, and Moses is preparing them, teaching them about the past and shaping a vision for their future. Moses says that when they get to the Promised Land, they are, first of all, to make an offering of their first fruits. The first fruits are their first product, their first margin of profit from the harvest. This is what about giving back to God first, as a reminder that everything actually comes from him. Then Moses teaches, "Then you shall make this response before the Lord your God. A wandering Armenian was my father. He went down into Egypt and lived there as an alien, few in number." So this describes the Israelites' ancestor Jacob, who lived in exile, more or less like a nomad. Moses is telling the Israelites that in their worship, they need to remember their humble origins. He continues, "And he became a great nation, mighty and populous, when the Egyptians treated us harshly and afflicted us by imposing hard labor on us. We cried to the Lord, the God of our fathers, and the Lord heard our voice." So this tribe of exiles eventually ends up slaves in Egypt. A humble beginning, humbled even further. But in their oppression, they turn humbly to God, and in their humility, God hears their cry. Moses continues, "The Lord brought us out of Egypt with a mighty hand and an outstretched arm, with a terrifying display of power, and with signs and wonders. And he brought us into this place and gave us this land, a land flowing with milk and honey." It wasn't by their own power that the Israelites escaped from Egypt and slavery, but because of God's strong hand and his outstretched arm. See, it was God who parted the Red Sea. It was God who provided food in the desert. And now it is God who is going to give them blessings and a life of abundance in that promised land. So how should they proceed? Well, Moses concludes, thank you, "Bow down before the Lord your God." Bow down before the Lord your God. Even as they experience the triumph of their entrance into the promised land and the complete defeat of all their enemies, they are to do so with absolute and utter humility. They are to bow down, like physically bow down, as a further physical proof of their humility. The Israelites call themselves the chosen people. And on the surface, that could sound like a prideful statement. But actually, it's meant to be the exact opposite. See, other nations in those days would boast of their strength and their accomplishments. For instance, the Greeks of their wisdom and their intelligence, the Romans of their military power and of their administrative ability. But the Israelites, they didn't have any of that. Yet they called themselves the chosen people, as a reminder that their only boast was that God had chosen them. They were nobody without God. They were nomads and slaves without God. All they had to offer was what God had given them. So as we begin this series, it might help to be honest. Honestly, humble pie doesn't go down very easy. It is difficult for all of us. And it's difficult for me because our ego gets in the way. We don't like to look bad or to lose control. We don't want to admit when we're wrong. We don't like to say that we're sorry. It's hard to be humble, even when we want to be. And a lot of the time, we don't want to be. If I've been disrespected, I don't want humility. I want an apology. If I've been offended, I don't want humility. I want payback. If I've been hurt, I don't want humility. I want revenge. These are all reasons why we need to work on humility by adjusting our attitude. We need to learn to see humility not as something that lessens or diminishes or weakens us, but something that actually strengthens us, something that builds us up to be the people that we want to be the person that God is calling us to be. So we should see humility then in three basic ways. First of all, humility grounds us in the basic reality that there is a God, and it's not me. Just like the Israelites, you have to recognize that God is God, that everything that we have comes from Him. Our tendency is to look at what we have, especially if we've worked hard for it or have been successful, and we think that we have it because of us. In fact, our achievements at work or at school, our finances, and even our family, all of them are gifts from God. Now, don't get me wrong. Your efforts matter. Your efforts matter a lot. They're incredibly important. But they must be recognized and understood in the context of what God has given you, of what God has done for you, of what God is doing for you right now. Second, humility grounds us in the basic reality that we are made for relationships. See, we need one another, and humility is a basic ingredient. It's incredibly helpful for success in any kind of relationship. If you can be humble, then you can be kind because you're able to put the needs of others before yourself. If you can be humble, then you can be merciful. You can more easily receive and extend forgiveness because you recognize your own faults and your own failures first. If you can be humble, then you can be compassionate because you take the time to understand somebody else's situation because it's so useful, helpful, and attractive. Humility is incredibly powerful in all of our relationships. And thirdly, humility grounds us in the basic reality that God insists on it before He's ever even willing to act in our lives. See, you can be successful with God, without being highly intelligent or clever in business or in finances. You can be successful with God and not be graceful in appearance or skillful in athletics. You don't need any of that to be successful with God. But you do need humility. In fact, the Bible tells us that God opposes the proud and gives grace to the humble. See, God humbles those who exalt themselves, but He lifts up those who humble themselves. That's just the way things work. Eventually, that's the way things work. Humility is the soil. Humility is the ground on which God can work in our lives, growing and blessing and favoring. For all of those reasons, over the next few weeks, we're going to take time to look at the attitude of humility. So this week's challenge is just simply to commit to this series over the next 5 weeks, which is pretty easy to do because you can catch it every time you come to church on Sunday or on our website in case you miss. It's important to commit to it because the attitude adjustment we're talking about is not an easy one, as simple as it might be. Humility isn't thinking less of yourself. It's just thinking of yourself less.